They spat in the old scout's coffee, and he thanked them like they had done him a favor. Morning light spilled across Fort Calder like melted brass, catching on belt buckles and rifle barrels, turning the dust in the air into floating gold. Elias Whitaker sat on an overturned supply crate near the edge of the yard, shoulders slightly bent, gray hat pulled low, hands wrapped around a dented tin cup that had seen more years than most of the young soldiers laughing behind him. Someone had dropped a pinch of dirt into his drink. Someone else had stirred it with a twig. The joke had passed through the camp like a lazy breeze. Elias only nodded once, poured a little of it onto the ground, then took a slow sip like nothing in the world could rush him. Some men carry pride like a loaded gun. Elias carried his like an old pocket watch, quiet, worn smooth, never shown unless needed. The soldiers didn't understand that kind of man. To them he was just the old scout they hired cheap because he asked for almost nothing. $40 a month, a place near the stable, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. They didn't know why the Apache traders who sometimes passed near the ridge always gave him a wide, respectful distance. They didn't know why Elias could look across 20 miles of broken desert and tell you where the next rain would fall. They only saw the slow walk, the patched coat, the way he thanked a man who had just insulted him. Beside his boot rested a small silver compass hanging from a thin chain, its surface scratched by time but polished by careful hands. Every so often his thumb brushed across it without thought, like a man checking a pulse. Private Danner noticed it first. "That thing even work anymore, old-timer?" he asked with a smirk, tipping his chair back on two legs. Elias turned the compass slightly, letting the needle settle like it had done 1,000 times before. "Still points true," he said softly. "That's more than most folks can say." A few chuckles rolled across the porch. Not cruel this time, just uncertain. The kind of laughter men use when they aren't sure if they've just been taught something. A wagon rattled past the fort gate, iron rims clanking against dry stones. Somewhere a horse snorted. Somewhere a flag rope tapped steady against a wooden pole. Elias watched it all the way a winter tree watches snow, patient, unmoved, knowing seasons change whether men notice or not. Sergeant Mercer stepped down from the porch then, boots hitting dirt hard enough to make a point. He glanced at the compass, then flicked the chain with one finger. "Funny thing about kindness," he said. "Out here it just makes you look weak." Elias met his eyes, not challenging, not lowering his own. Just steady. "No," he answered after a moment. "It just makes other people show who they are." Mercer scoffed and walked off, but Elias had already gone back to his coffee. The sun climbed higher. Heat shimmered across the yard. And somewhere deep in the quiet spaces between laughter and wind, the past waited patiently, like it always does, for the right hour to be remembered. By midday the heat had settled over Fort Calder like a heavy wool blanket, pressing the smell of leather, sun-baked wood, and black coffee into the air. Elias Whitaker had moved to the shade beside the water barrels where the horses came to drink, his movements slow but never wasted, like a man who had learned long ago that energy was something you spent carefully. A young cavalry horse refused the trough, its ears twitching, muscles tight beneath its brown coat. The stable hands pulled at the reins, muttering frustration, but Elias stepped forward with the same quiet patience he used for everything else. He did not grab the rope. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed one weathered hand near the animal's neck and waited. 30 seconds passed, then another 30. The horse exhaled, long and low, and finally lowered its head to drink. One of the boys watching frowned. "How did you do that?" Elias wiped his palm on his trousers. "Most creatures listen if you stop trying to force them." The boy nodded slowly like he had just heard something important without knowing why. Later, near the supply wagon, Elias noticed a crate positioned half an inch off level. Nobody else would have seen it. He nudged a small rock under the corner without a word. An hour later when the wind picked up, that crate stayed steady while another nearby tipped and spilled blankets into the dust. "Private." Danner looked between the two, puzzled, but Elias was already walking away toward the outer fence where the desert stretched wide and empty for miles. 20 miles out, heat waves shimmered like water. Elias studied the horizon the way some men read newspapers. His eyes followed the flight of two hawks circling higher than usual. He watched a faint line of disturbed sand move where no wagon trail existed. His thumb touched the silver compass again. Not checking direction, remembering something. Sergeant Mercer approached again, slower this time. You always staring out there like you expect something to come walking over the ridge. Elias did not look away. Everything comes from somewhere, he said. Mercer crossed his arms. You talk like a man who has seen too much. Elias gave a small shrug. Everyone has. Some just admit it. The afternoon passed in small moments like that. A loose hinge Elias tightened without being asked. A water ration he quietly moved into the shade. A patrol route he suggested should shift 50 yards east because the ground there held fewer blind spots. Nobody asked how he knew. Nobody thanked him either. But when the sun began dropping lower, painting long shadows across the yard, the fort seemed to run just a little smoother around him, like gears finding alignment. Near sunset, an Apache woman trading beadwork at the outer post paused when she saw Elias. She touched 2 fingers lightly to her chest in a gesture too quick for most to notice. Elias answered with the smallest nod. No words passed. Mercer saw it. You know her? Elias answered simply. I know respect when I see it. The bugle for evening count sounded across the fort, clear and lonely. Men gathered. Boots scuffed dust. Names were called. Elias stood at the back, just another hired scout in a line of uniforms. But as the last light touched the silver edge of his compass, the metal caught the sun in a way that made it shine brighter than it should have, like something that had seen other forts, other flags, other days when men did not laugh so quickly. The evening air cooled just enough to carry the scent of sage from the hills beyond Fort Calder, and with it came a silence that felt different from the rest of the day, the kind of silence men who had lived long on the frontier learned to notice. Elias Whitaker sat near the outer rail fence with a small piece of charcoal and a flat scrap of wood, drawing lines so faint most men would have thought he was passing time. But the lines were not random. They followed the curves of the land beyond the ridge, the dry wash that twisted like a sleeping snake 3 miles out, the narrow pass between 2 red rock formations nearly 15 miles west. Private Danner wandered close enough to see the markings. That's supposed to be a map? He asked. Elias did not look up. Everything is a map if you pay attention long enough. Danner studied the simple drawing. You been out there recently? Elias shook his head slightly. Not recently. The answer sounded incomplete, but Elias offered nothing more. A supply wagon rolled past, and its left wheel gave a small, uneven bounce. Elias watched it without turning his head fully. That axle will split inside 2 weeks if they do not rotate it, he said quietly. The driver laughed. This wagon came from St. Louis. Best iron money can buy. Elias nodded once. Iron remembers stress even if people forget it. The driver rode on. 2 hours later, the quartermaster made a note to inspect it after noticing the same flaw. Small things followed Elias like that. Observations that landed softly and proved themselves later. As the sun dropped closer to the horizon, painting the sky in long bands of copper and faded blue, Colonel Nathaniel Briggs arrived from inspection rounds, his presence announced by nothing more than the way conversation naturally lowered around him. He was a tall man, precise in movement, the kind of officer who believed order kept chaos away. His eyes moved across the yard and paused briefly on Elias. That the new scout? He asked Mercer. Mercer answered with a thin smile. If you can call him that. Spends more time helping horses than scouting. Briggs watched Elias another moment. And yet the horses seemed calmer. Mercer did not answer. The colonel approached slowly, boots measured against the packed earth. Whitaker, is it? Elias stood, respectful but not stiff. Yes, sir. Briggs studied him like a man trying to remember a face from a long-forgotten photograph. You ever serve in organized units before? A simple question. Elias paused just long enough for the wind to tug lightly at his coat. Long time ago, he said. Briggs waited for more. None came. Mercer chuckled softly. Probably chased rabbits for some volunteer outfit. Elias did not react. Instead, he bent and picked up a loose nail near the colonel's boot before it could work into a horse hoof. He handed it over without comment. Briggs accepted it slowly. Something unreadable crossed his face. Not recognition. Not yet. Just a small disturbance and certainty. As the final light of day stretched long shadows across the fort yard, Elias glanced once more toward the western ridge, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if measuring distance by instinct alone. Weather will shift tomorrow, he said quietly. Mercer scoffed. Sky is clear for 100 miles. Elias answered without looking at him. Storms do not always begin where you can see them. The night settled slowly over Fort Calder, not with darkness, but with layers of fading light. The last orange line on the horizon stretching thin like a dying ember, while lanterns began to glow one by one along the wooden walkways. Elias Whitaker remained near the outer edge of the fort where the land opened into miles of quiet desert. His posture relaxed, but his eyes moving with quiet purpose, measuring distances no ruler could mark. A warm wind moved across the sand, but Elias noticed something inside it that did not belong. A faint second current. Cooler. Moving against the expected direction. He bent slightly and touched the dust near his boot, rubbing the fine grains between his fingers like a man testing flour. Private Danner approached carrying a lantern. You really think the weather is changing? Elias stood slowly. Weather always changes. Question is whether we change with it. Danner followed his gaze. Looks the same to me. Elias pointed toward a line of low brush nearly 200 yards beyond the outer fence. See how the top leaves lean east while the lower branches lean west. Danner squinted. Wind does strange things. Elias nodded. Not strange. Just honest. Inside the fort, evening routines continued. Tin plates clattered. Someone played a slow tune on a harmonica. Mercer leaned against a post telling a story that drew laughter from the younger soldiers. But outside the easy rhythm of camp life, Elias quietly began making small adjustments no one ordered. He suggested moving 2 water barrels 6 feet closer to the center yard. He asked a stable boy to tie the nervous cavalry horse on the north side instead of the south. He picked up a forgotten coil of rope and placed it near the watch ladder. None of it looked important. Each change took less than a minute. Mercer noticed eventually. You planning to redecorate the whole fort? He called. Elias answered calmly. Just making sure things are where they might be needed. Mercer laughed. Needed for what? Elias met his eyes without any challenge. For whatever comes that we did not plan for. Mercer shook his head and walked away. Near the command porch, Colonel Briggs stood reviewing reports by lantern light. His attention drifted again toward Elias, noticing how the old scout moved without hurry, yet seemed to be everywhere small problems waited. A loose gate latch fixed. A bucket turned upright before it could spill. A lookout reminded to keep his field glass facing west instead of south. Briggs finally spoke. Whitaker. Elias turned. Yes, sir. Briggs studied him carefully. You act like you expect trouble. Elias considered the word. Not trouble, sir. Just patterns. Briggs frowned slightly. Patterns of what? Elias glanced once toward the darkening ridge. Of how small mistakes become big ones if nobody notices early. The colonel said nothing for a long moment. Then he nodded once and returned to his papers, though his thoughts clearly stayed elsewhere. As the first stars appeared, the desert grew quieter than before, the kind of quiet that made even the insects pause between their sounds. Elias rested one hand on the silver compass again. The needle trembled slightly, though there was no movement around him. His voice came barely above a whisper. Still pointing true, he said to no one. And far beyond the reach of lantern light, something unseen shifted across the night air like a page turning toward the next chapter. The hours just before dawn always belonged to the men who paid attention, and Elias Whitaker had always been one of those men. While most of the fort slept under thin army blankets, he sat on an empty grain sack near the watch ladder, listening to the kind of silence that carried information if a man knew how to hear it. The night air felt different now. Not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like the sky was holding its breath. A lantern flickered behind him, and Private Danner climbed down from the watch platform, rubbing his eyes. Nothing out there, he said with a tired yawn. Elias nodded slightly, but did not agree. You ever notice how quiet gets before something changes? Danner shrugged. Quiet just means nothing is happening. Elias finally looked at him. No, quiet usually means something already started. Danner did not understand, but he remembered the words later. A few minutes later, Elias stood and walked the inside perimeter of the fort, not like a guard checking posts, but like a carpenter checking the strength of a house before a storm. He paused near the ammunition shed and suggested moving 2 crates 3 feet farther from the door. He asked another soldier to keep extra canteens filled and placed near the north wall. When asked why, he only said, "Closer is easier than farther when time matters." Mercer saw this again and shook his head. You planning for ghosts again, old man? Elias answered calmly. I plan for what men forget. Mercer picked up Elias's silver compass from the crate where it rested and turned it in his fingers. What makes this thing so special anyway? The chain slipped loose from its worn clasp and fell into the dirt. Mercer tossed it back without care. Elias picked it up slowly, brushing dust from the glass with his thumb, his expression unchanged. It reminds me to stay pointed the right direction, he said simply. Mercer laughed. Looks like it needs a better chain. Elias nodded slightly. Most things do after enough years. As the first pale blue of morning began to touch the horizon, Elias made one more quiet adjustment. He asked the night watch to change their viewing angle by about 30 degrees toward the western gap between two distant ridges. The soldier hesitated. Orders say south. Elias answered gently. Orders were written before today. Something in the calm certainty of his voice made the man adjust his field glass anyway. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Mercer noticed and smirked. Still seeing patterns? Elias answered without irritation. Always. Then he returned to the same grain sack and poured himself another cup of coffee, this time clean, steam rising slowly into the cool morning air. The silver compass rested beside him again, the cracked glass catching the first light of sunrise. For a moment, it looked less like a tool, and more like a memory. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, touching the fort walls with gold, Elias watched the western ridge with the quiet focus of a man who had learned long ago that preparation rarely looks important until the exact moment it becomes everything. The morning unfolded slowly, but something underneath it had changed, like a floorboard that had begun to bend before anyone heard the crack. The fort moved through its routines, breakfast lines, tack inspections, patrol assignments, but a quiet tension now lived in the spaces between conversation. Elias Whitaker noticed it in the way the cavalry horses kept turning their ears toward the western ridge, in the way a flock of small desert birds lifted suddenly from the brush and did not settle again. He finished his coffee and stood without hurry, walking toward the command porch with the same steady pace he used for everything important. Colonel Briggs was already there studying a dispatch map. Elias stopped 3 steps short, respectful. Sir. Briggs looked up. Yes, Whitaker. Elias spoke plainly. Recommend shifting the outer patrol 20 yards north and doubling watch on the west approach. Briggs studied him. Based on what? Elias answered without drama. Movement patterns. Small signs. Things lining up. Mercer overheard and laughed from nearby. We are moving patrol routes because the old scout has a feeling now. Elias did not react to the remark. He only added, Sir, sometimes waiting to be certain costs more than adjusting early. Briggs looked between the two men, then back toward the open land. The colonel was not a man who liked guesses, but he was also not a man who ignored instinct when it came from someone who spoke without trying to impress. After a long moment, he nodded once. Shift the patrol. Mercer opened his mouth to object, but stopped when the colonel raised one finger slightly. Orders moved quickly after that. Riders repositioned. Lookouts adjusted their posts. Water barrels Elias had suggested earlier now sat exactly where tired men would need them. Ammunition crates he had asked moved earlier now sat within easier reach of the defensive wall. None of it looked dramatic. None of it looked heroic. It just looked organized. Time passed. 30 minutes. 45. Nothing happened. Mercer shook his head again. All this for nothing. Elias answered quietly. Nothing is usually the best outcome. Then just before noon, a distant dust line appeared along the western ridge. Not fast, not chaotic, just steady movement where there had been empty horizon before. The lookout who had adjusted his glass hours earlier was the first to notice clearly. Movement west, he called. Not panic, just alert. Briggs stepped forward immediately, field glass raised. He said nothing for several seconds, then lowered it slowly. The adjustments Elias suggested had placed every man in better position without anyone realizing why until now. The patrol that had shifted north now had clear visibility. The water barrels sat in shade where they would last longer. Even the nervous cavalry horse now stood calm, tied where sudden noise would not startle it. Briggs turned slowly toward Elias. You expected this. Elias answered in the same quiet tone. I expected something. Exact shape does not matter if you prepare for the possibility. Mercer said nothing now. The dust on the horizon remained distant, but the fort no longer felt casual. It felt ready. Briggs studied Elias again, longer this time. Where did you learn to think like that? Elias rested his hand lightly on the silver compass. From men who taught me that survival belongs to those who notice early. The colonel nodded slowly, but this time there was no doubt in his expression. Only a growing question he had not yet found the answer to. And for the first time since Elias arrived, nobody laughed at the old scout. The dust on the western horizon never reached the fort. By early afternoon it faded like a bad memory, leaving only quiet wind and unanswered questions behind. Patrol riders returned with simple reports. Traders moving along a distant route. No threat, no urgency, just life on the frontier continuing as it always did. But something had already changed inside Fort Calder. Men moved differently now. They checked straps twice. They watched the ridgeline a little longer than before. And when Elias Whitaker walked past, fewer men laughed. Colonel Briggs stood alone on the command porch holding his field glass long after the dust had settled. His mind was not on the horizon anymore. It was on the old scout who had seen something before anyone else even thought to look. Finally, he stepped inside his office and pulled open a long, neglected records chest. Old files lived there. Transfer papers, unit reports, names of men who had come and gone across too many years. He did not know exactly what he was looking for. Only that experience had taught him instincts like Whitaker's were rarely learned by accident. Paper shifted. Leather folders opened. A thin layer of dust marked time better than any calendar. Then his hand paused. A familiar name printed in faded ink. Whitaker. He pulled the file free slowly. The paper inside had yellowed with age, edges worn from handling long ago. Captain Elias Whitaker. Frontier Reconnaissance Division. Commended for strategic positioning during the Red Canyon campaign. Credited with preventing catastrophic losses through early terrain analysis. Status listed as missing after a winter expedition 23 years earlier. Presumed dead. Briggs leaned back slightly. The room felt quieter. He read the report again. Same name. Same calm handwriting in the margins describing defensive positioning methods that sounded very familiar. Move supplies closer before needed. Adjust sight lines early. Prepare for possibilities rather than react to certainty. The colonel closed the file halfway, thoughtful. Outside his window, Elias crossed the yard carrying nothing more than a water bucket for the stable hands. No rank insignia. No medals. No announcement of who he had been. Just a man doing small useful things. A knock came at the door. Mercer stepped in. Sir. Briggs looked at him, then at the file, then back again. How long has Whitaker been here? Mercer shrugged. 3 weeks. Quiet man. Keeps to himself. Briggs tapped the folder lightly. Did he ever mention prior service? Mercer shook his head. No, sir. Acts like he has nothing to prove. Briggs gave a slow nod. Sometimes those are the men who already proved everything. Mercer frowned slightly, but said nothing more. Later that afternoon, a courier rider arrived carrying routine correspondence from headquarters. As the satchel was opened, one young clerk paused suddenly, staring toward Elias, who stood near the fence adjusting a loose rail. The clerk stepped closer, squinting like a man trying to match a memory to a face. Sir, he said quietly to Briggs, holding up an old dispatch copy. I think I have seen that name before. Briggs did not answer immediately. He only looked again toward the quiet old scout standing in the afternoon sun, a man who carried himself like someone who had walked through history without needing anyone to know. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether Elias Whitaker had a past. The question was how a man like that could choose to live as if he did not. By late afternoon, the sunlight turned softer, stretching long across the parade ground like a quiet reminder that another day on the frontier was ending. But inside Colonel Briggs, something had just begun. He stepped out from his office holding the old record folder at his side, not like evidence, not like accusation, but like a piece of history that had finally found its way back. Elias Whitaker was near the well, helping a young private lift a heavy water bucket onto a wooden brace. No one had asked him to help. No one had thanked him either. That was simply where he always seemed to be, where work was needed but attention was not. Briggs approached slowly. Conversations nearby faded without anyone realizing why. The colonel stopped about 6 feet away. Whitaker, he said. Elias turned, calm as always. Yes, sir. Briggs studied his face again, but this time he was not searching for recognition. He was confirming it. Why did you never say? Elias tilted his head slightly. Say what, sir? Briggs opened the folder just enough to show the name printed inside. Captain Elias Whitaker. The air seemed to still around them. Mercer froze where he stood. Private Danner looked between the two men without understanding yet. Elias looked at the paper only briefly. No surprise. No pride. Just acceptance, like a man looking at an old photograph. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. Briggs asked the question carefully. You were declared missing. Many believed you were gone. Elias nodded once. Some parts of me were. The answer hung in the air, heavy with years nobody there had lived through. Briggs closed the folder slowly. You prevented losses back, then using the same methods you used this morning. Elias gave a small shrug. Patterns do not change. Only faces do. Mercer stepped forward, confusion written across his face. You mean this old scout was an officer? Briggs did not take his eyes off Elias. Not just an officer. One of the best terrain strategists on this frontier. Silence followed. The kind of silence that changes how men see someone. Briggs removed his gloves slowly, deliberately, the gesture carrying more weight than any speech. Then, without ceremony but with complete sincerity, he stood straight and gave Elias Whitaker a full military salute. For a heartbeat nobody moved. Then Private Danner followed. Then another soldier. Then another. One by one the men of Fort Calder straightened, some awkward, some ashamed, some thoughtful, until the yard held a quiet line of respect that had not been there that morning. Mercer hesitated the longest. His jaw tightened. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he lifted his hand too. Elias did not rush. He did not seem changed by any of it. He simply returned the salute with the same calm dignity he had carried all along. Then he lowered his hand and said in the same quiet voice, respect should never need a pass to exist. No one answered. The words did not accuse. They did something harder. They told the truth. A breeze moved across the yard, carrying dust and sunlight, and something else now. Understanding. And as Elias turned back toward the stable to finish carrying water like nothing unusual had happened, the men around him finally understood something that rank alone could never teach. The sun was already touching the far hills when the fort finally returned to its usual rhythm, but something invisible had shifted in the space between the men. Nobody said it out loud. Out here men rarely did. But where laughter had once followed Elias Whitaker, now quiet nods did. Where jokes once filled the air, now space was made for him without anyone mentioning it. Elias did not seem to notice. Or if he did, he treated it the same way he treated everything else, as something temporary. The cavalry horse he had calmed that morning needed fresh water again. He carried the bucket himself, same as always. Private Danner hurried ahead and lifted the heavy side of the trough without being asked. Elias gave him a small nod. Nothing more. Mercer approached slowly, hands resting on his belt, his usual sharp confidence replaced by something less certain. He stood there for a moment before speaking. You could have told us, he said. Elias set the bucket down carefully before answering. Would it have changed how you treated me? Mercer did not answer right away. That was answer enough. Elias continued in the same calm voice. Then it would not have mattered. Mercer looked down at the dirt, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of leather cord. He cleared his throat. I fixed the chain, he said, holding out the repaired strap for the silver compass. Elias accepted it with the same steady hands that had carried it across decades. Thank you, he said simply. Mercer nodded once and walked away without another word. No apology spoken. None needed. Nearby, Colonel Briggs watched the exchange from the porch, arms folded, understanding now that some lessons could never be ordered, only learned. As the evening cooled, the Apache woman who had traded beadwork earlier returned briefly at the outer fence. She said nothing. She only placed a small woven thread beside the post where Elias stood, a quiet symbol of respect. Elias inclined his head slightly in return. The exchange lasted less than 5 seconds, but every man who saw it understood something deeper than rank. As the last light faded, Briggs approached one final time. There is an open officer position, he said. Your record would place you there immediately. Elias looked out toward the darkening land for several seconds before answering. I appreciate that, sir. But I think I am where I am supposed to be. Briggs studied him. Why remain a scout? Elias rested his hand lightly on the compass, now hanging again from its repaired strap. Because out here, rank may end a fight, but simple decency prevents one from starting. Briggs gave a slow, respectful nod. No argument followed. As night finally settled over Fort Calder, Elias returned to his quiet place near the outer fence, watching the same wide land he always watched. The same land that had taken years from him and given wisdom back. A young private passing by hesitated, then offered a small, respectful gesture with 2 fingers to his hat brim. Elias returned it without ceremony. No speech, no lesson, just quiet dignity passing from one man to another. And under the vast western sky, with the wind moving soft across the desert and the stars beginning to appear one by one, the old scout sat exactly where he had always been, not needing anyone to remember who he once was, because he had never forgotten who he chose to be.